Think you know the story of the 300 Spartans? Forget the Hollywood fairy tales. Reality was far scarier, dirtier, and more cynical. In this video, we will uncover blood-curdling facts and show war as it really was, uncensored and unpolished. You will learn how the world's greatest empire was humiliated by a bunch of madmen who decided on a suicidal attack with zero chance of survival. We will tell you about a politician who brazenly lied to his people and forged the will of the gods to force citizens to give up easy money for the sake of war. You will hear the harrowing story of an evacuation where people in panic abandoned their sick relatives while loyal dogs swam after their masters' ships until their hearts burst from grief. Awaits you is a tale of a king whose pride was so great that he ordered executioners to flog the sea with chains and brand the water with red-hot iron. You will find out why the body of the legendary Leonidas was subjected to a monstrous desecration that textbooks remain silent about, and how one traitor sold the future of an entire country for a handful of coins. But be sure to watch until the very end, because that is where the most uncomfortable and scandalous truth hides. How heroes who fought for freedom instantly turned into cruel tyrants and racketeers. We will reveal the secret of how the democracy we are so proud of was built on stolen gold, the fear of allies, and the blood of innocents. This is not a story about feats. This is a story about how survival turns people into monsters. Imagine the horizon disappearing. You are standing on the shore, and the familiar blue of the Aegean Sea is being erased. It is gone. In its place is a forest, an endless, creaking forest of masts moving straight toward you. 600 warships. Do you hear that sound? It is not the sound of the surf. It is the rhythmic, nauseating knock of thousands of oars striking the water in unison. The creaking of wood, taut ropes, and the smell. The heavy smell of unwashed bodies, exotic spices, and old fear. This is what the end of the world smells like. For a resident of Athens, the summer of 490 BC was not just an anxious time. It was the moment reality cracked. Put yourself in their shoes. Your world is tiny. Your democracy is an experiment barely 20 years old, a fragile teenager surrounded by wolves. And now, arriving at your doorstep is not just an enemy. History itself is coming to crush you under the sole of a sandal. The Achaemenid Empire. Even the name sounded like a sentence. It was not a country. It was a machine. A monstrous mechanism for grinding civilizations that stretched from India to the Balkans. They had already swallowed Lydia, Egypt, Ionia. They did not lose. Never. King Darius did not fight cities. He erased them. In his retinue was a special servant, whose only task was to whisper in his ear every evening before dinner, "Master, remember the Athenians." Think about that level of hatred. A superpower, ruling half the world, was obsessed with revenge against a single city. And now, that obsession had materialized in the form of 25,000 professional killers landing in the Bay of Marathon. Do you feel that trembling in your knees? That is not a metaphor. It was not fear that reigned in Athens. It was paralysis. News of the Persian landing hit the city like a sledgehammer on glass. The market square, the agora, turned into a hive of madness. Someone shouted that they should surrender. Someone was packing bags. Someone prayed to gods who remained silent. Understand one thing. Democracy in a moment of mortal danger is chaos. 10 strategoi, 10 generals, argued until they were hoarse. Surrender? Open the gates and hope the slave collar would not chafe too much. Or go out into the field and die, so that 1,000 years later someone would write a beautiful epitaph about you. Logic dictated the former. The Persian army was a steamroller. The Athenians were just amateurs, militiamen, farmers, and potters who put on bronze once a year. There were no chances. The math of war was against them. But the Greeks had hope. Sparta, the only professional soldiers in all of Hellas, the best killers of the ancient world. Athens sends a runner, Phidippides. This man achieves the impossible. He runs 240 kilometers in 2 days. Imagine that run. It is not a sport. It is the run of an animal driven by fear. The run of a man carrying the life of his city in his fist. He beats his feet to blood. His lungs burn. He bursts into Sparta, falls to his knees before the ephors and wheezes, "Save us!" And what does he hear in response? Silence. And then, a polite, cold refusal. "We cannot march now," say the Spartans, adjusting their red cloaks. "It is the sacred month of Carnea. The moon is not yet full. Religion forbids us to fight. Wait a couple of weeks." Wait a couple of weeks. When the enemy is 2 days' march from your gates. Historians still argue, was it fanatical religiosity or cynical calculation? The Spartans hated Athens no less than the Persians. Maybe they just wanted to let the barbarians do the dirty work? Maybe they decided Athens was an acceptable sacrifice? Imagine Phidippides' despair. He ran back to the doomed city, bearing news worse than death. "We are alone." That phrase should have broken them. We are alone. At that moment, when the runner returned and exhaled the truth, Athens should have fallen. Without a single shot fired, simply from terror. The city froze. People looked at each other and saw the same thing in their neighbors' eyes, the reflection of burning houses and women being driven into slavery. Persian propaganda worked perfectly. They brought with them the deposed Athenian tyrant Hippias, promising to return order. And the city itself was full of those ready to open the gates. Betrayal hung in the air, thick as the summer heat. A fifth column waited for a signal. It was enough for someone on the city wall to raise a shield, reflecting the sun, and that would be the sign to the Persians. "Come in, we surrender." But it was here, at the edge of the abyss, that something happened that does not fit into the dry lines of textbooks. The instinct of a cornered beast kicked in. Instead of cowering in a corner, Athens bared its teeth. At the popular assembly, Miltiades, a man whose name would soon become a legend and then a curse, threw his authority onto the scales. "If we wait behind the walls," he shouted over the noise of the crowd, "traitors will open the gates. The only chance is to go to meet death. Attack them where they do not expect it." It was madness. Lead 9,000 hoplites out from the protection of walls into an open field. Against cavalry. Against archers who could blot out the sun with arrows. It was suicide. But it was the suicide of proud people. Desperation won the vote. The Athenians closed their shops, put on their armor, took shields painted with their clan symbols, and walked out of the city. Look at this column. It is not a parade. It is a funeral procession that decided to take as many enemies with it as possible. 9,000 citizens, almost the entire male population. If they perish, the city dies. There will be no one left to protect the women and children. Athens bet everything. Absolutely everything. They walked along the dusty road to the northeast, through the mountains, to the plain of Marathon. Every step took them further from home and closer to what the mind refused to accept. With them marched a small detachment from the city of Plataea, the only ones who sent help. 1,000 men. 1,000 friends who decided to die for company. It was a touching and terrible loyalty. 10,000 Greeks against an armada that had pitched its camp on the shore, occupying space from horizon to horizon. When the Athenian army rose onto the hills bordering the Marathon plain, they saw it with their own eyes. Not in runners' tales, but in reality. The Persian camp buzzed like a disturbed hive. Ships, dragged onto the sand, stood in rows resembling dragons' teeth. Smoke from thousands of bonfires rose into the sky. The gold and bronze of elite units sparkled in the sun, hurting the eyes. It was power, capable of crushing them without even noticing. The Greeks stopped. Fear, cold and sticky, crept under their armor again. They set up camp on the slope, looking down at their death. And so they stood for several days. Two armies looked at each other. The Persians waited for the Greeks to get scared and scatter, or for traitors in Athens to give the signal. The Greeks waited for a miracle, or for the Spartans, who still were not coming. The silence over the Marathon Valley was deceptive. It was the silence before a lightning strike. Down in the Persian camp, commanders were already discussing plans for dividing the loot. They did not take this handful of people on the hill seriously. For them, it was just another stop on a long tour of conquests. They were sure the very sight of their army would force the Greeks to kneel. But they did not know one thing. A man with nothing to lose turns into the most dangerous creature on the planet. On the hill, among olive trees and dust, the Greeks sharpened spear points. They were silent, but it was not the silence of submission. It was concentration before a leap. Fear burned out, turning into cold, ringing rage. They understood. Help would not come. The gods were busy with their own affairs. The Spartans were watching the moon. And behind their backs were their children. The air over the plain became dense, electrified. History froze, holding its breath. And in this silence, Miltiades gave an order that seemed absurd, impossible, suicidal. But it was he who started the chain reaction, the blast wave of which we feel to this day. The Greeks formed a phalanx, but not the usual one. They stretched the line, making it dangerously thin in the center. It was a trap, or stupidity. The Persians below started laughing, seeing this thin line of people begin to descend the hill. They did not yet know that this laughter would be the last sound many of them would make in their lives. Because the Greeks were not just walking to die. They were going to teach the empire a lesson in anatomy, to show what happens when steel meets arrogance. The mechanism was launched. The time for talk was over. Only blood remained. The distance between the two armies was approximately 1.5 kilometers. 1.5 kilometers of void that historians would later call the death zone. By all rules of military science of that time, hoplites, heavy infantry encased in 30 kilograms of bronze, had to walk this distance at a pace, slowly, saving their breath, keeping formation. To walk otherwise meant destroying the phalanx before impact. But Miltiades knew what the Persians did not. Persian archers start killing from 200 meters. If they walked at a pace, the army would turn into a porcupine stuck with arrows long before they could strike with a spear. And then, the incredible happened. The phalanx ran. Imagine that sound. First, it was a dull rumble, like a rockfall in the mountains. 10,000 pairs of sandals striking the dry earth. Then a ringing mixed in, the rhythmic, growing clang of thousands of shields against breastplates, scabbards against greaves. The Persian commanders watched this with bewilderment turning into contemptuous pity. "These people have lost their minds," they said. "Attack at a run? Without cavalry? Without archers? Against the best army in the world?" It looked not like an attack, but like mass suicide. The Persians drew their bows. The sky darkened. Clouds of arrows rained down on the running Greeks, but speed played its role. The Greeks slipped through the kill zone faster than the archers could reload their quivers. And then happened what even the gods on Olympus physically felt. Impact. Two masses of people collided with the force of a tectonic shift. The front rows simply vanished, crushed by the weight and inertia of the rear. The crack of breaking spears was louder than the screams. And here, Miltiades' gambit worked. His plan was cynical and brilliant. He intentionally weakened the center, leaving only a few rows of depth there, but maximally strengthened the flanks. It was a sacrifice. The men in the center knew they were bait. They knew they would be crushed, and they were crushed. The Persian elite, the so-called immortals, smashed through the center of the Greek formation like a knife cuts through rotten cloth. They were already shouting victory. They already saw the backs of fleeing Greeks and thought the battle was won. But they did not look to the sides, and on the sides, steel claws were snapping shut. The strengthened Greek wings smashed the Persian flanks, clad in wicker armor that did not withstand the blow of a heavy dory spear. The Greeks turned inward. The hunter became the prey. The Persians found themselves in a sack. The tightness was so terrible that warriors could not raise their arms to strike. A crush began. Panic is a contagious disease, and it spreads faster than the plague. The great army that conquered Asia turned into a crowd of terrified people running toward saving water. The slaughter moved into the surf. The water foamed and turned brown. The Greeks, intoxicated with rage, pursued the enemy right into the sea, grabbing the gunwales of departing ships with their hands. Cynaegirus, brother of the playwright Aeschylus, latched onto the stern of a Persian trireme and did not let go until his hand was cut off. Then he latched on with the other, and when he lost that one too, he bit into the wood with his teeth. This was not heroism in the bookish sense. It was pure animal fury of people protecting their home. 7 Persian ships were left to rot on the sand. The rest cast off. 6,400 enemy corpses lay on the shore like a terrible harvest. The Greeks lost only 192 men. Victory? They hugged each other, cried, laughed, fell from exhaustion right into the bloody mud. It seemed it was all over. But at that moment, when euphoria veiled their eyes, Miltiades saw something that must have stopped his heart. The Persian fleet was not leaving to the east, to Asia. It was turning and rounding Cape Sunion. They were going to Athens. At that moment, a terrible guess pierced the minds of the strategoi. The shield. That very sunbeam someone flashed from the city walls before the battle. The traitors in Athens were not just waiting, they were acting. The city was empty. The entire army was here, on a blood-soaked beach, 40 kilometers from home. And the enemy fleet, full of fresh forces, was heading toward defenseless women and children. The Persian plan was genius. Lure out the army, tie it down in battle, even lose it, and meanwhile capture the city from the sea. Imagine that horror. You have just achieved the impossible. You survived hell. Your hands are shaking so much you cannot hold a water flask. You are dehydrated, wounded, concussed by blows to the helmet, and you are told, "Get up, we have to run." Not one runner, the entire army. And they ran. The second time that day. It was the scariest marathon in history. Not a sports run in light jerseys. It was a forced march of death. 9,000 men in pierced armor, with heavy shields, under the scorching August sun. 42 kilometers along the rocky roads of Attica. Without food, almost without water, on sheer willpower. If they are late even by an hour, their wives will become concubines, and their sons eunuchs. They ran, swallowing dust, and every step resonated with pain throughout their bodies. Men fell and died of heart failure right on the road, but the column did not stop. They had no right to stop. A race against time and sails. The Persian fleet, driven by the wind, flew toward the Bay of Phaleron. The Greek infantry, driven by fear for their loved ones, wheezed on the mountain passes. Who is faster, wood and canvas, or tormented human flesh? When the sun began to dip toward sunset, the first Persian ships entered the harbor of Athens. The fleet commander, Admiral Datis, was already anticipating an easy landing. The gates are open. Traitors are waiting. The city is a ripe fruit, ready to fall into hands. But when he looked at the hills surrounding the city, the smile slid off his face. There, in the rays of the setting sun, bronze glistened. On the walls and hills, staggering from fatigue, leaning on spears so as not to fall, stood the same people he had fought that morning at Marathon. Dirty, covered in dried blood and dust, they looked not like soldiers, but like demons risen from hell. They made it. They beat the fleet by literally half an hour. Datis looked at them from the deck of his flagship. He saw their eyes, and he understood. These people will not surrender. Landing now against this wall of rage was pointless. The element of surprise was gone. The traitors in the city went to ground like rats, seeing the return of the army. The admiral looked at the shore for a long time. The Athenians were silent. They simply stood, creating a living wall between the empire and their families. Datis gave the order. The fleet turned around. Oars struck the water, and the giant armada began to slowly leave for the open sea, away from the shores of this cursed, insane country. The Athenians watched them go, and only when the last sail disappeared over the horizon did they allow themselves to fall to the ground. They saved their city. They humiliated the world's greatest empire. They proved that a free man defending his home is stronger than a slave driven by a whip. The whole world learned that the Persians could be beaten. The myth of Achaemenid invincibility was trampled into the mud of the Marathon plain. But in this victory hid poison. Looking at the departing ships, wise men understood, this is not the end. Darius will not forgive such humiliation. He will return, not with a punitive detachment, but with a force that will blot out the sun. The Athenians woke the beast by hitting it on the nose, but not killing it, and the beast will remember that blow. While Athens celebrated, drank wine, and praised Miltiades, who, by the way, would soon be left to rot in prison for debts, democracy's gratitude is short. Across the sea, in the golden halls of Susa, scribes were already drafting new mobilization decrees. Darius was preparing, and after his death, his son would take over the task, the one whose name would become synonymous with destruction. Ask yourself, was this victory worth what would come next? Would it not have been better to submit and pay tribute, saving thousands of lives, than to provoke wrath that would burn Greece to the ground 10 years later? Are you ready to risk everything for the word freedom, knowing the price could be absolute? The Athenians made their choice. Now they had to pay for it. In the deep mines of Laurion, a slave struck rock with a pickaxe and heard a strange sound. Not a dull thud against stone, but a ring. A ring that would change everything. Silver, the blood of war. Darkness, stuffiness, and the sound of metal striking stone. Deep underground, in narrow tunnels resembling burrows in Laurion, A slave whose name history did not preserve made a movement that saved Western civilization. His pickaxe broke through the rock and opened a vein. It was not just a glimmer in the light of an oil lamp. It was Maronea, the legendary third vein, purest silver. It was the year 483 BC. 10 years had passed since the miracle at Marathon. For 10 years, Athenians lived in an illusion of safety while Persia licked its wounds and suppressed rebellions in Egypt. And now, suddenly, wealth fell upon Athens that they could not have even dreamed of. From the bowels of Attica gushed a stream of talents of silver. Fever gripped the city. Imagine a modern state suddenly finding a giant oil field. What do people want to do? Spend it, of course. Populists in the People's Assembly were already tearing their throats on the podium. "This is the people's money. Let's distribute it to the citizens." 10 drachmas to everyone. A decent sum. One could buy new clothes, good wine, throw a feast. It was the simplest, most democratic, and deadliest idea in the history of Athens. If they had done this, if they had eaten and drunk away this silver, then 3 years later Xerxes would have walked through Greece in a parade march, and we might now be speaking Farsi. But in Athens, there was a man who saw further than his own wallet. Themistocles. Look closely at this face. This is not Leonidas with his Spartan directness. Themistocles was different. He was a political predator, a genius of intrigue, a man who could sell snow in winter. He was not an aristocrat of the old school. He was an upstart, a self-made man. He walked the agora, looked into the eyes of shopkeepers and fishermen, remembered the name of every citizen. He knew what Persia was doing. Spies reported that the new king, Xerxes, was not just gathering an army. He was moving mountains and turning rivers. Themistocles understood. Marathon was just a light slap to a giant. The retaliatory strike would be such that infantry would not save them. A fleet was needed. But how to force the people to give up free money for the sake of building some ships? Try going out to voters today and saying, "We won't raise your pensions, we'll build aircraft carriers because there might be a war in 3 years." You would be thrown off the podium. Themistocles resorted to the greatest lie in the name of salvation. He understood the psychology of the crowd. A distant threat does not frighten. The Persians are far away, across the sea. Their faces are forgotten. An enemy is needed here and now. And he pointed a finger at the island of Aegean. Neighbors, trade competitors, an eternal pain in the rear for Athens. Themistocles inflated a minor border conflict to the scale of an existential threat. "Look!" he shouted on the Pnyx. "The Aeginetans are laughing at us. Their pirates rob our ships. We need a fleet to punish them." It was a bluff, a grandiose spectacle. He scared them with pirates from a neighboring island to prepare them for a battle with the master of the world. And it worked. Greed and pride fought against the desire for immediate gain, and Themistocles, manipulating the passions of the crowd, wrestled this decision from the assembly. The Athenians voted to renounce the money. The silver of Laurion flowed not into citizens' pockets, but to the shipyards of Piraeus. Athens turned into a giant factory. The quiet city of philosophers and landowners disappeared. The air filled with the screaming of saws, the banging of hammers, and the acrid smell of boiling pitch. Forests were cut down to the root. 200 triremes. Think about that number. 200 high-tech killing machines in 2 years. It was a feat of industrialization comparable to building tank armadas in the Second World War. What is a trireme? Forget pictures from children's books. It is not a cruise liner. It is a torpedo made of spruce and oak, 37 meters long, only 5 wide. narrow, predatory, unstable. Inside is hell. 170 rowers sitting in 3 tiers, packed like sardines. No ventilation, the smell of sweat, urine, and fear. But when these 170 men work as a single organism, the trireme flies across the water at the speed of a modern motorboat, turning into a projectile capable of smashing an enemy's hull with a bronze ram. Themistocles was not just building ships, he was changing the DNA of his city. Before, war was waged by the rich, those who could buy hoplite armor. Now, the fate of Athens rested on the shoulders of the poor, the Thetes.
It was they who sat at the oars.
Democracy was becoming radical. He who rose votes. Aristocrats gritted their teeth watching the rabble become the backbone of defense. But Themistocles was relentless. To finally cement success, he brought in heavy artillery, the Oracle of Delphi. Priestesses, having breathed in vapors, issued a vague prophecy. Only wooden walls does Zeus grant to Athena as indestructible. Conservatives interpreted this literally. Hide behind the old wooden palisade on the Acropolis. Themistocles, displaying miracles of rhetorical gymnastics, convinced everyone. Wooden walls are the hulls of our ships. The gods command us to go to sea. Imagine the irony. The freedom of Greece was forged in dark mines by the hands of slaves dying from back-breaking labor, and paid for with silver that a cunning politician stole from his voters by deceiving them with a fairy tale about a small war. By the year 480, the fleet was ready. 200 brand-new triremes bobbed on the waves in the bays of Piraeus. Crews trained until their hands were bloody calluses, learning to turn on the spot and hold formation. Athenians looked at the forest of masts and felt a strange mixture of pride and anxiety. They had become a maritime power. They had changed their destiny, but they did not yet know how right their lying leader was. While they tarred bottoms and sharpened rams, on the other end of the world, the earth was already trembling. The invasion mechanism had been launched. Runners from Asia Minor brought news that made blood run cold, even in the bravest. It was no longer just an army. It was a migration of peoples. Rivers dried up when Xerxes' army stopped to water their horses. Cities went bankrupt simply trying to feed this horde once. Themistocles stood on the shore of Piraeus, peering into the horizon. He bought time. He gave Athens a sword. But now remained the main question. Would they have the spirit to lift this sword when they saw what was bearing down on them from the east? Silver turned into wood. Wood turned into weapons. Now the weapons had to come alive through the will of men. And at that time in Susa, the new king was trying on armor. He had not forgotten Marathon. He had not forgotten anything. Xerxes planned not a war. He planned the execution of an entire people. And for this execution, he gathered forces the likes of which the world had never seen. The shadow of a giant already covered the islands of the Aegean Sea, and every Greek felt the chill of that shadow. The time for intrigues was over. The time of the apocalypse was arriving. If you think you have seen big armies, forget it. What moved west in the spring of the year 480 was not an army. It was a natural disaster clothed in flesh and steel. It was the migration of an entire world. Imagine locusts. Billions of insects that block out the sky and leave behind bare, gnawed earth. That is exactly what Xerxes' invasion looked like. In Susa, the heart of the empire, Darius no longer sat on the throne. The old king had died, leaving his son the throne and unfinished revenge. Xerxes was different. If Darius was a pragmatist, a state builder, then Xerxes was the rock star of the ancient world. Tall, handsome, drowning in gold and his own divinity. It wasn't enough for him just to win. He needed to surpass his father. Darius demanded submission. Xerxes demanded adoration. Darius sent generals. Xerxes led the campaign himself to personally see Europe fall at his feet. Historians still break spears over the size of his army. Herodotus, that great storyteller, wrote of 5 million people. We know that is physically impossible. They would have drunk all the rivers of Greece dry in 3 days. But even if we divide that number by 10, we get 200,000 or 300,000 soldiers. For antiquity, this is a nuclear weapon. No economy, no logistics of that time could digest such a mass of people. When this horde moved, the earth literally shook. Seismographs, had they existed, would have gone crazy. They marched, and rivers truly dried up. Imagine, the vanguard comes to the Scamander stream, drinks its fill, and the rearguard, arriving an hour later, finds only wet mud. They ate everything: grain, livestock, supplies of cities unlucky enough to be in their path. It was an ecological catastrophe. Xerxes was not just waging war on Greeks, he was waging war on geography. He was waging war on the laws of physics. On the Athos Peninsula, where storms once destroyed his father's fleet, he ordered a canal dug. To turn a peninsula into an island, just so his ships wouldn't have to round a cape. For 3 years, thousands of slaves under the blows of whips gnawed at the stone. It was engineering madness, a monument to pride. Why? To show the sea who was boss here. But the sea has its own character. When Xerxes' engineers built a giant pontoon bridge across the Hellespont Strait, that narrow strip of water separating Asia and Europe, a storm hit and smashed the structure to smithereens. Xerxes' reaction tells us more about him than all the chronicles. He didn't get upset. He flew into a rage, like a spoiled child whose toy broke. He ordered the engineers beheaded. That was par for the course. But then he ordered the sea flogged. Think about this scene. The executioners of the empire walk out onto the shore and start beating the salt water with chains, chanting, "Oh, bitter water, the master imposes a penalty on you for insulting him." They threw shackles into the depths to shackle the unruly element, and branded the water with red-hot iron. This isn't just a tyrant's madness. It is the collision of 2 worlds. Eastern despotism, where the king's will is a law of nature, collided with the chaos of the Western element. Xerxes sincerely believed he could command the waves. A second bridge was built. 700 ships tied together with cables of flax and papyrus, weighing tons. The deck was covered with earth, so horses and camels wouldn't be spooked by the sight of water. It was a floating road from Asia to Europe. The crossing began. It lasted 7 days and 7 nights, without break. Crossing the bridge were the masked immortals, Lydian spearmen, Indian archers in cotton clothes, Ethiopians in leopard skins with spears made of antelope horn. Chariots crossed, wheels rumbling on the planks. Cavalry crossed. Europe had never seen such a variety of death. Xerxes sat on a marble throne set up on a hill and watched his power flow west. They say he cried. When asked the reason, he replied, "I thought about how in 100 years, not one of these people will be alive." A sentimental executioner. As soon as the boot of the first Persian soldier stepped onto the European shore, horror ran ahead of the army faster than the wind. Cities of northern Greece didn't just surrender, they competed in the speed of falling to their knees. Xerxes' ambassadors walked ahead of the army, demanding earth and water. the ancient symbol of submission. And they received them. Thessaly, Thebes, Argos, powerful, proud polis, opened their gates. They saw this endless river of people and understood. Resistance is a mathematical error. It is not bravery. It is idiocy. Why die? Whispered aristocrats in Greek cities. The king is generous to those who serve him. Look at the Ionians. They live richly under Persian rule. Fear is rational. Heroism is not. An epidemic of betrayal, which the Greeks called Medism, going over to the side of the Persians, swept the continent. Greece crumbled like an old mosaic. To the south, in Corinth, a congress of the few remaining free cities gathered. The atmosphere resembled a funeral. Spartans, Athenians, Corinthians looked at a map that was becoming redder with Persian presence every day. They understood. In an open field against this horde, they had no chance. 200,000 against maybe 20,000 if everyone was gathered? They would simply be outflanked, surrounded, and crushed by mass. A narrow place was needed, a bottleneck, a point on the map where 1,000,000 people have no advantage over 1,000, where numbers become a hindrance, not a strength. Generals ran their fingers over parchment. The Vale of Tempe? Too wide. The Isthmus of Corinth? Too far. Athens would have to be surrendered. And then the Spartan king's finger stopped on a narrow strip of land between sheer cliffs and the sea, a place known for its hot sulfur springs, gates through which the only road to central Greece leads. Thermopylae, the hot gates. It was not a perfect choice. It was a mousetrap. But it was the only place where the monster could be made to bleed. While Xerxes enjoyed a triumphal march, accepting gifts from terrified cities, in the south, a handful of people began sharpening swords, preparing for a battle that was to be not a fight for victory, but a sacrifice for time. The armored locusts were approaching, devouring everything in their path. But they didn't yet know they would soon choke on a bone stuck in their throat. August 480. Imagine a place where geography decided to aid murder. Thermopylae. A narrow strip of land squeezed between the sheer wall of Mount Calidromus and the marshes of the Malian Gulf. The width of the passage is only 15 meters. This isn't a battlefield, it's a corridor. And in this corridor, the air smells of rotten eggs. Hot sulfur springs bubble right out of the rocks. The heat is such that bronze armor burns the skin even through the undergarment. Leonidas came here. Let's clear up the myth right away. With him are not just 300 Spartans. To be precise, there are about 7,000 Greeks. Thespians, Thebans, Phocians, but the 300 are the steel core. They are the king's personal guard, the Hippeis, and Leonidas chose them by a special principle. He took only those who had sons left at home. This is not an army. This is a suicide squad. Leonidas, who is already over 50, a very old man by the standards of that time, knew the prophecy. Either Sparta falls or its king dies. He was not going to win. He was going to fulfill a contract with death. Xerxes, arriving at the pass, set up his throne and waited 4 days. He was sure the sight of his ocean of people would make the Greeks dissolve into the mountains. They are just assessing their chances and will run now, his advisors told him. But the Greeks didn't run. Scouts reported a strange thing to the king. Spartans on the wall were combing their long hair and doing gymnastics. To the Persians, this looked like madness. In fact, it was a ritual of preparation for death. A Spartan makes himself beautiful only before heading to Hades. On the 5th day, the King of Kings' patience snapped. He waved his hand. "Bring them to me, alive!" And the meat grinder began. Understand the mechanics of this fight. There was no room for fencing here. In the narrow pass, the Persian numbers became their curse. The huge mass of people pressed on the front ranks, forcing them to walk straight onto Greek spears. The Persians, accustomed to maneuverable combat on the open plains of Asia, with their short spears and wicker shields, proved powerless against the phalanx. The Greek phalanx at Thermopylae worked like a piston. Lock shields, step forward, strike, step back. The wall of shields was covered in blood, slipped, but didn't break. Persians fell in rows. Their bodies became a rampart the next ones had to climb over. This wasn't war. It was the hard physical labor of butchers in a slaughterhouse. Heat, tightness, screams, crunching bones, and the monotonous rhythm of killing. Spartans switched out, rested, and stood back in line, working in shifts like at a factory. Xerxes couldn't believe his eyes. His army, which had conquered the world, was smashing against a handful of people like a wave against a breakwater. In a rage, he threw the elite into battle, the immortals. 10,000 of the empire's best warriors, the personal guard, glittering with gold. They marched in silence, inspiring terror. But in a narrow gorge, gold doesn't protect. The Spartans met them with the tactic of feigned retreat. The Greeks turned their backs, pretended to run in panic. The immortals broke formation, rushing in pursuit with a howl. And then the Spartans turned 180 degrees and chopped into the disorganized enemy ranks. The elite of the East lay down in the same place as the simple conscripts. They say Xerxes jumped up from his throne 3 times in horror for his army. The myth of invincibility collapsed for the second time. Steel and discipline were defeating mass. It seemed they could stand there forever, but history, as always, was changed not by valor, but by treachery. Ephialtes, a name that in Greek became synonymous with nightmare, a local resident who came to Xerxes not out of ideological reasons, but for a reward. "King, there is a path here," he said. The Anapaea path, leading through the mountains to the Greeks' rear. Think about the price of betrayal. Ephialtes received nothing legendary. He most likely died in poverty. But for a handful of gold coins, he sold not just a pass, he sold the future of his country. A Persian detachment of immortals under the cover of night, stepping on fallen leaves, the sound of which was drowned out by the wind, walked through the mountains. The guard of Phocians standing on the path simply scattered. In the morning, Leonidas found out. They were surrounded. It was the moment of truth. The strategic sense of defense vanished. The trap snapped shut. They had maybe a couple of hours until total annihilation. Most commanders suggested retreating while there was a tiny chance. And Leonidas let them go. He ordered the allies to leave, but he stayed. Staying with him were 300 Spartans, and, what is often forgotten, 700 Thespians under the command of Demophiles, who refused to abandon the Spartans, and 400 Thebans, who were possibly held as hostages, but they died in battle anyway. Why did they stay? Not for a beautiful death. Spartans were professionals. They didn't seek death. They sought efficiency. They stayed to cover the retreat of the others. If everyone ran, the Persian cavalry would catch up and slaughter them in the open field. Someone had to be the rearguard. Someone had to buy time with their life. The final scene of this drama did not look like paintings from the Renaissance. It was chaos and the rage of the doomed. The Greeks' spears broke. They fought with Xiphos swords. When swords broke, they beat Persians with their hands, choked them, tore at them with their teeth. Leonidas fell among the first. A furious struggle broke out around his body. The Greeks recaptured their king's corpse from the Persians 4 times, pulling him from a pile of bodies. This was no longer a battle. It was the extermination of a rabid beast that refused to die. The Persians, afraid to approach these bloodied demons within sword strike distance, retreated and simply buried them in arrows. The sky truly darkened. When archaeologists excavated Kolonos Hill, where the fight ended, they found thousands of arrowheads. Silence descended on the gorge. Everyone was dead. Xerxes walked across the field strewn with the corpses of his soldiers. He ordered Leonidas's body found, his head cut off and impaled on a stake. Unheard of barbarism for Persians, who usually respected brave enemies. It was a sign of fear. Xerxes was furious because he realized, if all Greeks are like these 300, he won't have enough men to reach Corinth. Stranger, if you go to Sparta, tell our citizens there, here we lie in the grave, having honestly fulfilled the law. So the poet Simonides would write on the stone. But that would be later. For now, the road south was open. The cork was popped. The avalanche that had been held back for 3 days gushed into the heart of Hellas. There were no more shields, no heroes, no barriers. Ahead lay defenseless Attica. In Athens, people looked north, and the horizon there was beginning to turn the color of smoke. News of Leonidas's death came quickly, and it brought no comfort. Heroism is beautiful, but the heroism of the dead does not protect the living. Illusions crumbled. The wooden wall of ships was their last chance. But now the enemy was walking on land, and his boots were already kicking up the dust of roads leading to the walls of the Acropolis. The city that had been preparing for this day for 10 years suddenly realized, preparing for death and looking it in the eye are different things. The time had come for the most terrible decision in the history of democracy. The news of Leonidas's death didn't just come to Athens. It crashed down on the city like the crack of a whip. Until that moment, the war was somewhere out there, in the north, beyond the mountains, in heroic gorges. Now it stood on the doorstep. Between the Persian cavalry and the Athenian agora, not a single army, not a single barrier remained. The road was open. The psychological dam collapsed, and panic, cold and sticky, flooded the streets faster than autumn rain. Imagine being told, your city, your home, the streets where you grew up, the graves of your ancestors, all of it is doomed. You have only a few days to pack your life into a bundle and run, not to another city, but into nowhere, to the sea, to the rocks. The popular assembly boiled. People screamed, demanded a miracle, demanded the gods intervene. And here Themistocles stepped out again. At that moment, he did something more grandiose than building a fleet. He forced an entire people to commit collective suicide for the sake of rebirth. He proposed surrendering the city. Athens is not walls and temples, he said, looking into the frightened faces of citizens. Athens is the people. Themistocles' evacuation decree is a document of despair and iron will. Women and children sent to Troezen, old men and property to Salamis. Everyone capable of holding an oar or spear to the ships. It was a logistical nightmare. Imagine the port of Piraeus in those days, the crush. Screams of mothers losing children in the crowd. Weeping. The smell of unwashed bodies and fear. Rich men trying to drag chests of gold with them, and poor men who had only the clothes on their backs. Now they were equal. Refugees. Ancient texts have preserved heartbreaking details. Plutarch tells of dogs howling and running along the shore after departing ships, throwing themselves into the water to swim after their masters. One dog, belonging to Xanthippus, Pericles' father, swam alongside a trireme all the way to Salamis and dropped dead from heart failure, having barely touched the shore. If even animals felt the end of the world, imagine what was going on in the souls of people. They left behind the sick who could not move. They left graves they swore to die for. Priests announced that the sacred snake of Athena on the Acropolis had not touched the honey cake. "Even the goddess has left the city," spread through the crowd. This rumor, likely started by Themistocles himself, became the final argument. The city emptied. When Xerxes' vanguard entered Athens, they found a ghost town. Empty streets, open doors of houses where uneaten food still stood on tables. Wind chased dust across the agora. Silence. Eerie, ringing silence instead of triumph. Xerxes walked through streets he dreamed of conquering, but there was no one to conquer. He felt cheated. His great victory was turning into a farce. But the city was not completely empty. On the Acropolis, behind an ancient wooden palisade, fanatics had locked themselves in. Old men, temple keepers, and those who literally understood the oracle's prophecy about wooden walls. They believed the old fence would save them better than the fleet. They threw stones at the Persians when they tried to climb the slope. The siege of the Acropolis was short and brutal. The Persians found a secret path near the sanctuary of Aglaurus. There is always a secret path, always a vulnerability. They climbed the rock and staged a massacre. The sacred place, the heart of Greek religion, was flooded with blood. Old men hugging statues of gods seeking protection were stabbed right at the altars. And then Xerxes unleashed fire. He wanted to erase the memory of this city. Temples built by generations went up in flames. Statues of archaic Chori, with their enigmatic smiles, fell and shattered, turning to lime from the heat. Rafters collapsed, sending sheaves of sparks into the black sky. Athena's sacred olive tree burned to the ground. Smoke from the burning Acropolis rose in a black column visible for tens of kilometers. On the island of Salamis, in the strait, stood the Greek fleet. Sailors and soldiers saw this smoke. They saw the sky over their homes turn crimson. It was a moment of absolute psychological breakdown. Imagine, you are standing on deck, gripping a rope in your hand, watching your past burn. Watching the house where you were born burn. Watching the gods you prayed to burn. Why fight now? For ashes? For a pile of rocks? Panic seized the fleet. It wasn't just fear of battle, it was existential terror. Admirals of other Greek cities, Corinthians, Spartans, shouted, "We're leaving! To the isthmus!" They wanted to run to the isthmus, build a wall, and defend the Peloponnese. Athens has perished, they reasoned, so there is no point defending the sea off its shores. The fleet, the only hope of Western civilization, was ready to scatter like a school of frightened fish. Commanders were already giving orders to hoist sails. Noise, shouts, bustle on the decks. The chaos of defeat seized the army even before the battle began. It seemed Themistocles' plan had collapsed. He evacuated the people to give battle at sea, but the sight of the burning city robbed men of their will. Xerxes, looking at the fire from his throne, was sure. The war is over. He broke their spine. He burned their heart. Only the fugitives remained to be finished off. He sent a messenger to Susa with news of total victory. He did not know that the fire destroying Athens did not kill the hatred, but distilled it. It stripped the Greeks of everything except the desire for revenge. A man with nothing to lose is terrifying. But a man watching his world burn is capable of madness beyond the logic of empire. On the deck of the flagship trireme, amidst general hysteria, Themistocles looked at the smoke and understood. He had one last cartridge left, the riskiest bluff of his life. If he didn't force them to fight here, now, in this narrow strait, Greece would cease to exist. History would freeze. Night fell on Salamis, a night lit by the glow of the fire. In the darkness, while Greek captains argued and prepared to flee, a small boat pushed off from the shore.
In it sat Sicinus,
A slave and tutor to Themistocles' children. He carried a letter not to allies, a letter to the King of Kings. Themistocles, cornered, decided to do what he did best. He decided to tell a lie so big that the ruler of the world himself would believe it. Amidst the night silence, broken only by the crackle of burning Athenian roofs, the small boat glided toward the Persian fleet. In it sat a man holding the fate of the Western world in his hands. Sicinus, Themistocles' trusted slave. He carried no weapons. He carried poison. Poison intended for the ears of one specific man whose ego was bigger than his empire. Themistocles, that fox in human form, understood one simple thing unavailable to other admirals. In the open sea, the Greek fleet is a corpse. 300 Greek ships against 600, maybe 800 Persian ones. The math is deadly. Persian ships are faster, their crews more experienced. There are simply more of them. If battle is given in the open, the Persians will surround the Greeks, encircle them, and drown them one by one. The only chance is to drag the Leviathan into a bathtub. Force him to fight in the Salamis Strait. The width of the strait at its narrowest point is a little over a kilometer. There, numbers don't matter. There, 800 ships will only get in each other's way, break oars, and collide hulls. But how to force a smart enemy to stick his head in a noose? How to convince Xerxes to enter the Narrows when he can simply blockade the straits and wait for the Greeks to die of hunger? A lie is needed. Sicinus appeared before the Persian commanders and delivered his master's message. The text of this letter is a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. Themistocles, commander of the Athenians, moves to the king's side, it read. The Hellenes are seized with terror and are planning to flee this night. Attack now, and you will capture them all at once.
if you wait, they will slip away.
It was a lie wrapped in truth. The Greeks really were panicking. They really wanted to flee. Themistocles used the real chaos in his camp as bait. Xerxes swallowed the hook along with the line. Why? Because tyrants always believe in betrayal. In their world, loyalty is bought and sold. Besides, Xerxes was in a hurry. Autumn was approaching, storms, supply problems for this giant horde. He needed a final, beautiful period in this war. He wanted to return to Susa a victor before the cold. He was offered an easy victory on a silver platter, and his pride didn't let him see the trap. The king gave an order that became a death sentence for his fleet. Enter the strait. Block the exits. No one must leave. All night, while the Greeks slept, gathering strength before death, the Persian fleet performed a complex maneuver. Imagine this logistical nightmare in the dark. Hundreds of heavy triremes, Phoenician, Egyptian, Ionian, enter the narrow neck of the strait. They go in 3 columns. Rowers work to exhaustion, afraid to lose rhythm. Captains shout in whispers. They blockade the island of Plataea to catch those who end up in the water. The Egyptian squadron goes around the island from the other side, closing the western exit. The trap snapped shut. But not for the Greeks, for the Persians. By dawn, the Persian sailors were exhausted. They had rowed all night, hadn't slept, maneuvered in unfamiliar waters. Meanwhile, in the Greek camp, Themistocles, learning from a defector that the exits were blocked, smiled contentedly. He got his way. There is no way back. Spartans and Corinthians, who an hour ago wanted to run to the isthmus, now understood. There is nowhere to run. They are locked in a cage with a tiger. And now they have only one choice: kill the tiger or be eaten. The fear of flight transformed into the rage of cornered rats.
The morning of September 28th, 480 BC, began with a theatrical production. Xerxes was so confident of triumph that he ordered his gold throne set up on Mount Agalio, rising above the strait. Around him stood scribes with tablets, ready to record the names of heroes, and executioners with swords, ready to chop off the heads of cowards. The king prepared to watch the show. He expected to see a regatta. He expected to see Greek ships in panic, trying to break through past his orderly ranks, exposing their backs to blows. Instead, when the first rays of the sun chased away the fog, he heard a strange sound. It wasn't cries for mercy. It was a song, a paean, a battle hymn sung by thousands of throats simultaneously. Aeschylus, who was there in one of the rows, preserved for us these words that still give goosebumps. "Forward, sons of Hellas! Save the motherland! Save your wives, children, your fathers' gods' temples, ancestors' tombs. The fight is now for everything."
Persian captains standing on the lead ships went cold. The Greeks were not running. They were forming a battle line. Their ships, low, heavy, less maneuverable but sturdy, were coming out of the bays in a united front. The wind, which always blows from the sea into the strait in the morning, began to whip up waves. Light, tall Persian ships began to rock, exposing their hulls. Heavy Greek triremes sat low and stable in the water. Nature, geography, and one man's cunning converged at a single point. The Persian fleet, huge and clumsy, found itself squeezed in a narrow corridor. The rear ranks pressed on the front ones, trying to break through to easy prey and curry favor with the king. The front ranks braked, seeing the enemy attacking. A crush began. The formation broke even before the first strike. Themistocles stood on the deck of his trireme and waited. He waited for the right moment when the chaos in the enemy camp reached its peak.
He saw the gold throne on the mountain. He saw the glint of brocade. And he knew that in a few hours, that throne would become the most uncomfortable seat on earth. The greatest bluff in history worked. The empire entered the strait, but would only be able to leave it as wreckage. Greek trumpets sang the attack. Oars struck the water, foaming the sea. Thousands of tons of wood and bronze lunged forward. Now everything depended not on politicians, but on helmsmen and rowers. The time for words was over. It was ramming time. Crunch. If you could hear the sound of the Battle of Salamis, it wouldn't be the clashing of swords, but the deafening, nauseating crack of breaking wood. Imagine 200 tons of oak and human flesh slamming into another ship's hull at 10 knots. A bronze ram, this underwater hammer, smashes through planking, turning oars into splinters and rowers into a bloody mess. This wasn't a duel. It was industrial destruction. In the strait, a hell that defies description unfolded. Persian ships, squeezed in the narrows, deprived themselves of their main advantage, maneuverability. They became victims of their own numbers. Rear ranks, trying to curry favor with the king, pressed forward, ramming their own, breaking formation, creating a traffic jam of burning wood and screaming people. It was a crush in a stadium during a fire, only on water and with weapons in hand. Greek triremes worked like a pack of wolves, cornering a herd of buffalo. They struck hulls, backed water, turned, and struck again. Impact. Water pours into the breach. The ship lists. Men chained to oars or trapped in holds know they have exactly as long to live as it takes for water to fill their lungs. And on the surface happened what turned a naval battle into a slaughter. When a Persian ship sank, its crew ended up in the water.
And here, cruel statistics came into play. Most Persians, inhabitants of deserts and mountains, didn't know how to swim. And those who did were dressed in heavy, waterlogged clothes or armor. They went to the bottom by the thousands, silently or with a gurgling scream, pulled down by the weight of their own gear. The Greeks, however, if their ship perished, simply swam to the shore of Salamis, where their own were waiting. The sea that morning became the ally of the Hellenes and the executioner of the Aegeans. In the center of this chaos, not just soldiers were dying. The elite of the empire was dying. Aristobignes, Xerxes' own brother, admiral of the fleet, was killed by a javelin and thrown into the abyss. When soldiers see their commanders dying, discipline evaporates. Panic became a chain reaction. Huge, clumsy Phoenician ships tried to turn around, colliding hulls, breaking each other's oars, turning into helpless targets for nimble Greek triremes. Xerxes, sitting on his gold throne on the slope of Mount Aegaleo, gripped the armrests until his knuckles turned white. The spectacle didn't go according to script. Instead of triumph, he was watching a reality show about the collapse of his dream. Scribes who were supposed to record names of heroes were recording names of dead men in horror. At some point, the king jumped up, tore his clothes, and screamed in impotent rage. He saw Artemisia, queen of Halicarnassus, fighting on his side, ram and sink an allied Persian ship to save herself. Xerxes, not figuring it out in the chaos, decided she sank a Greek and exclaimed his famous phrase full of bitter irony. "My men have become women, and my women men." He admired betrayal, mistaking it for valor. Such was the absurdity of that day. The water in the strait changed color. It's not a poetic metaphor. Ancient authors write that the sea turned red with blood and black with wreckage. Corpses floated so thickly, it seemed one could walk on them from island to mainland without getting feet wet. By noon, the wind changed, and waves began beating against the hulls of damaged Persian vessels, finally finishing them off. The remnants of the Great Armada, the pride of Asia, turned in panic and rushed to the exit of the strait, into the open sea, away from this meat grinder. The Greeks pursued them, finishing off laggards like hunters finish off wounded game. In the evening, Xerxes looked at the empty strait. On the shore lay wreckage with gilding, pieces of royal standards, bodies of his best warriors. The fleet was broken. But most terrifying was that the king himself was broken. In his head, clouded by fear, a single thought was born that displaced all plans of conquering the world. The bridges. Those very pontoon bridges across the Hellespont over which he came to Europe. If the Greeks sail there now and burn them, he will be trapped. Cut off from home, in a strange, hostile country, with 1,000,000 hungry mouths with nothing to feed. The great King of Kings, ruler of the universe, suddenly felt like a cornered rat. Xerxes' fear was irrational. He still had a giant land army capable of grinding Greece into powder. But the naval catastrophe robbed him of his reason. He saw a threat to his personal safety in every Greek sail. He decided to run. But he couldn't just leave. That would be losing face, and admission of total failure. He needed a scapegoat,
someone to stay and clean up this bloody mess. And such a man was found. Mardonius. His son-in-law, his best general, one of the hawks who had pushed the king into this war. Mardonius understood. If they all leave, it's the end of the empire. Greece will rise, Ionia will rise, Egypt will rise. A garrison must be left. "Sire," he said, looking into the frightened eyes of the ruler, "do not grieve over planks. We came to conquer land, not water. Leave me part of the army, and I will bring you Greece in chains, or die." It was an offer Xerxes couldn't refuse. He left Mardonius 300,000 of his best soldiers, select infantry and cavalry, and he himself, with the rest of the horde, turned into a crowd of ragamuffins, began a hasty, shameful retreat to the crossing. The Greeks, watching columns of dust receding into the distance, couldn't believe their luck. They survived. The wooden wall held. But when the euphoria subsided, they realized the terrible truth. The war was not over. The lion left, but left his most vicious and hungry cub in the cage. 300,000 professional killers, under the command of a general with nothing to lose, still stood on Greek soil. They hadn't gone anywhere. They simply withdrew north, to Thessaly, to winter, feed the horses, and sharpen swords. Winter of the year 480 descended on Hellas as an anxious shroud. It was a strange time. Athenians returned to the ashes of their city. They wandered among ruins, trying to find remnants of their homes, sheltering from the wind behind soot-stained temple walls. Hunger, cold, and the realization that in spring it would all happen again. Mardonius sent letters from his winter camp, not with threats, but with offers. He was smart. He tried to split the Greek alliance, offering Athens a separate peace, gold, and power over all Greece if they switched to the Persian side. It was the devil's temptation. He offered Sparta nothing. He knew one could only speak to them in the language of steel. The alliance of Greek police was bursting at the seams. Spartans, as always, stalled for time, building a wall at the isthmus and unwilling to march into central Greece. Athenians blackmailed Sparta. "If you don't come, we will accept Mardonius's offer, and then our fleet will become Persian." It was diplomacy on the verge of blackmail, a game of nerves where the stake was the survival of the race. Finally, in the spring of 479, the ice broke. Something clicked in Sparta. Maybe they realized the wall wouldn't save them if Athens became an enemy. A huge army of Peloponnesians, led by Pausanias, Leonidas's nephew, regent for his young son, marched north. Athenians, Plataeans, Megarians joined them. It was the largest army Hellas had ever assembled. About 100,000 men by some estimates. Never before and never since were the Greeks so united. All old grievances were forgotten for one goal: kill Mardonius. Two giant armies began to converge near the town of Plataea in Boeotia. This was not to be a battle in a gorge or a naval brawl. This was to be a pitched battle on a plain, a fair wall-on-wall fight. What the Persians had waited for so long. Mardonius rubbed his hands. He had the best cavalry in the world, and now he had a place to deploy it. He was sure he would crush these amateurs. He didn't know that a Greek phalanx, cornered, is scarier than any beast. The final act of the drama was preparing to begin under the scorching sun of Boeotia. The gods took their seats in the orchestra. Summer of 479 BC. Boeotia. Imagine heat that melts the brain. Dust hanging in the air, clogging nostrils, lungs, and pores of the skin. And the smell. The sweet, heavy smell of tens of thousands of horses and hundreds of thousands of unwashed bodies concentrated on a patch of scorched earth by the Asopus River. Here, near the town of Plataea, history froze in paralysis. For 2 weeks, two giant armies looked at each other across the river. It was a war of nerves. The Greeks feared Persian cavalry and didn't descend onto the plain.
The Persians feared the Greek phalanx and didn't climb the hills. It was a strategic dead end, a logistical nightmare. Try feeding 110,000 Greeks and 300,000 Persians in scorched earth conditions. Water became more expensive than gold. Persian archers poisoned springs. Cavalry cut off food supply lines. The Greek army, this bulky, barely glued-together alliance of eternally squabbling cities, began to disintegrate from thirst and hunger before the first spear strike. The Greek commander, the Spartan Pausanias, made the only possible but risky decision: retreat at night. Change position, get closer to water and mountains. But a night maneuver of an ancient army is always a recipe for disaster. Imagine the chaos. Darkness, mules crying, weapons clanking. No one knows the way. Orders don't get through. Some units went too far. Others refused to leave at all, considering retreat a disgrace. One Spartan commander literally picked up a boulder and threw it at Pausanias' feet, voting with that rock against retreat. By dawn, the Greek army ended up not in new positions, but torn into 3 isolated chunks scattered across the hills. Formation was lost. They were vulnerable as a tortoise without a shell. When the sun illuminated this picture, Mardonius didn't believe his eyes. He saw not an army, but a fleeing mob. His scouts reported, "They are leaving! Sparta is abandoned!" The general who had dreamed of this moment all winter made a fatal mistake. He decided victory was already in his pocket. He didn't need to form his troops, he just needed to catch the runaways. "Forward!" he commanded. "Finish them off!" The Persian army broke formation and rushed in pursuit. It wasn't an attack, it was a hunt. They ran, shouting and hooting. Sure, the Greeks wouldn't even turn around. Mardonius, on a white horse, in shining armor, galloped at the head of his 1,000 immortals, anticipating triumph. But they forgot who they were dealing with. They forgot that Spartans don't run, they regroup. Pausanias, seeing the approaching avalanche, did what in any other army would be considered madness. He stopped his men and ordered them to wait. Not build a shield wall, not ready spears. Wait. He began performing a sacrifice, trying to get a favorable sign from the gods. Priests cut goats, looked at entrails, and shook their heads. No omen. Imagine this moment. 50,000 Persians rushing at you with a howl, the sky turning black with arrows. Persian archers stick their wicker shields into the ground and begin methodically shooting the standing Greeks. Spartans fall, pierced by arrows, but no one raises a shield. No one takes a step forward. Iron, inhuman discipline. They stood under a shower of death and watched their regent king poking around in the guts of a sacrificial animal. They waited for the order. Many died without ever drawing a sword. It was the highest aerobatics of martial spirit, suppressing the instinct of self-preservation for the sake of obeying the law. Finally, when the Persians were almost within striking distance, Pausanias, perhaps just tired of waiting, or really seeing something in the liver of yet another goat, raised his hands to the temple of Hera and screamed, "Forward!" The spring, compressed to the limit, uncoiled. The phalanx came into motion. It wasn't the acceleration of a locomotive, it was an explosion. The Spartans, enraged by the long wait under fire, hacked into the Persian ranks. The impact was terrible.
The Persians were brave men. They threw themselves onto long Greek spears, grabbing them with their hands, breaking shafts, trying to get to the enemy with daggers. But physics cannot be cheated. The Persians had no armor, only quilted jackets. They had short swords and wicker shields. Coming against them was a wall of bronze, bristling with 3-meter pikes. It was a meat grinder. The Greeks worked with shields like a press, crushing and grinding the enemy's light infantry. Mardonius found himself in the center of this hell. He fought like a lion, killing many Spartans, but the ring tightened around him. And then happened what decides the fate of empires. A simple Spartan soldier named Arimnestos, according to other sources he threw a stone, saw the shining rider. Impact. A stone or spear hit the general in the head. Mardonius, the king's viceroy, conqueror of Greece, collapsed into the dust with a crushed skull. An army is an organism. The general is the brain. When the brain dies, the body is seized by convulsions. As soon as Mardonius's white horse was empty, news swept through the Persian ranks like an electric discharge. "The commander is dead!" And the great army, which a minute ago was sure of victory, turned into a herd. Panic began. 300,000 men turned and ran. Not an organized retreat, but running, dropping weapons, trampling each other, with only one thought: to reach the wooden fortified camp. The Greeks pursued them on their heels. Athenians, arriving from the left flank, where they smashed the traitor Greeks, allies of the Persians, joined the massacre. The Persian camp, surrounded by a wooden wall, became a trap. The Greeks broke down the gates. What happened next is hard to call a battle. It was extermination. The Greeks were taking revenge for Thermopylae, for burned Athens, for desecrated temples, for the fear they had lived in for 10 years. Pity was turned off. Of 300,000 Persians, according to historians, even if figures are exaggerated, the scale is clear. No more than 40,000 escaped, having managed to leave with another general, Artabazus, who, being smarter than Mardonius, didn't even enter the battle, but immediately led his corps back to Asia. The rest remained lying in the mud of Boeotia. The Asopus River was dammed with corpses. Blood mixed with dust, turning the plain into a red swamp. By evening, the noise of battle died down. Only the groans of the wounded and the buzzing of flies gathering for a feast remained. Greek hoplites, staggering from fatigue, leaning on bloody spears, wandered among mountains of bodies. They didn't yet fully realize what had happened. They didn't just win. They destroyed the threat forever. Persian land power was broken. Never again would a Persian soldier step onto European soil with the intent of conquest. History turned 180 degrees. The West held out. The chaos of freedom defeated the order of tyranny, but defeated it by methods of the cruelest slaughter. Pausanias walked to the center of the captured camp. Before him stood Mardonius's tent, huge, silken, full of gold dishes, soft carpets, and exquisite delicacies prepared for the Persians' victory feast. Nearby lay corpses in simple linen clothes. The Spartan looked at this splendor, wiped blood from his sword, and ordered his cooks to prepare dinner. Ordinary Spartan black broth of blood and lentils. The contrast between two worlds lay before them. And in this tent, amidst gold and corpses, a scene was being prepared that was to become the final, bitter lesson of this war. Mardonius's tent was not just a tent. It was a portable palace sewn of silk and audacity. When Greek commanders, crunching dried mud on their greaves, walked inside, they stopped dead. Outside lay mountains of corpses and the sun-scorched Boeotian plain smelling of death. Inside reigned the scent of incense, saffron, and roasted meat. Tables stood with dishes of pure gold, groaning with delicacies Persian cooks prepared for their general's triumphal feast. Soft carpets, woven by the best masters of Babylon, muffled the steps of heavy sandals. Pausanias, regent of Sparta, the man who had just led the century's bloodiest massacre, looked at this splendor with an expression hard to describe. It wasn't envy. It was the squeamish surprise of a predator finding its prey wearing a diamond collar. He summoned his helot cooks. "Prepare me dinner," he ordered, not taking his eyes off the gold goblets. "A regular Spartan dinner." An hour later, on the adjacent table, next to exquisite Persian dishes, stood a wooden bowl with black broth, a brew of pork blood, vinegar, and lentils. Food Spartans were proud of, while other Greeks joked that, after tasting it, you understand why they are so willing to die. Pausanias laughed. He invited the other strategoi, pointed a hand at the two tables, one worthy of gods, and the second fit only for beggars, and uttered a phrase that echoed through the centuries. "Hellenes! I gathered you to show the stupidity of this Mede leader. Having such a table and living in such luxury, he came to us to take away our poverty." In that laughter was the whole essence of the conflict, the collision of the satiated East and the hungry West. The Persians lost not because they were weak, they lost because they had something to lose. The Greeks had nothing to lose but their rocks and olive trees. Outside, while commanders philosophized, soldiers looted. The Persian camp turned out to be Ali Baba's treasure trove. There was so much gold its price crashed in a single day. Simple hoplites, who had never seen anything more valuable than a silver drachma, stuffed helmets with gold bracelets, necklaces, cups. Helots, not understanding the value of the yellow metal, sold it to resellers from Aegean for a pittance, thinking it was copper. It was on this Persian gold that Aegean and Thebes would later build their wealth, becoming the first oligarchs of the new era. A tenth of the loot, by tradition, was given to the gods. In Delphi, the center of the world, the Greeks erected a monument that was supposed to stand forever. They took bronze weapons of fallen Persians, melted them down, and cast a column in the form of 3 intertwined snakes. On their coils, they carved the names of 31 cities. Only 31. Out of hundreds of Greek polis, only these 31 dared raise a shield against the empire. The rest either hid or betrayed. This serpent column stands in Istanbul to this day, an ironic witness to how short human memory is and how durable bronze is. But while Spartans divided gold and laughed at the dead lion, on the seashore, something far more important was happening. The Athenians were looking at the water. Athens lay in ruins. Their temples were burned, houses destroyed, walls torn down. But they still had a fleet, and they still had the understanding. Sparta is strong on land, but the world belongs to he who commands the sea. Victory at Salamis and Plataea overturned the consciousness of Athenians. They realized that now they were not just one of the cities, they were the saviors of Hellas. And saviors demand payment. On the ruins of the old world, a new monster began to sprout. Athens, intoxicated by triumph, began cobbling together a maritime alliance. At first, for protection against a Persian return, cities were offered to pay dues into a common treasury on the island of Delos. "Pay us, and we will protect you with our ships," said Athenian ambassadors. And cities paid. But very soon, protection turned into a racket. When the island of Naxos wanted to leave the alliance, the Athenian fleet, that very fleet of freedom that defeated Xerxes, sailed to Naxos, destroyed its walls, and forced the inhabitants to pay tribute by force. The hero turned into a tyrant
faster than new olives could grow in Attica. Democracy, born in the agony of Marathon, learned to be imperialist. Athens began building the Parthenon with money stolen from allies. That very golden age of Pericles we admire was paid for by the fear of other Greeks. Sparta watched this with growing hatred. Yesterday's brothers in arms, standing shoulder to shoulder in the phalanx at Plataea, began sharpening knives for each other. The Great War with Persia ended, but it only opened the door for an even more terrible slaughter, the Peloponnesian War.
A civil war of all against all, which would bleed Greece dry and eventually throw it at the feet of new conquerors, the Macedonians, and then the Romans.
So what do we see, looking back through the smoke of burning Athens and the dust of Plataea? The Greco-Persian Wars are not a Hollywood blockbuster with a happy ending. It is a cruel lesson in survival. We saw how fear turns people into heroes, and victory turns heroes into monsters. We saw how democracy can be just as bloody as tyranny, and how freedom is bought at the price of absolute, inhuman cruelty. Western civilization survived. You and I do not speak Persian. We do not bow to kings kissing the ground. We inherited theater, philosophy, elections, and architecture from the Greeks. But along with this, we inherited their arrogance, their knack for dividing the world into us and barbarians, their belief that might gives the right to dictate will. Look at the serpent column.
The names on it have worn away. The snake heads have broken off. Empires come and go. Persia fell. Athens fell. Sparta turned into a tourist attraction. But the question those wars asked remains open. When you look at the map of the world, at borders, at armies ready to tear at each other's throats, ask yourself, who won in reality? Those who died for freedom in the Thermopylae Gorge, or those who used their death to build a new empire of lies? Is freedom worth burning the whole world for? Or does the world exist only as long as there are those ready to burn in that fire? The answer to this question each of you must find for yourself. History has finished its speech. Now, silence.